The rain in the city didn't fall. It punished. It lashed against the cracked pavement, soaking through Clara's thin coat, until she couldn't tell the difference between the freezing water and her own tears. At 7 months pregnant, every step felt like a battle against gravity, her hand protectively shielding her swollen belly, as if she could hide her unborn child from the cruelty of the world. Just an hour ago, the only home she had ever known with Marcus had its locks changed. Her suitcases, cheap and bursting at the seams, sat abandoned on the curb getting drenched. Marcus hadn't even looked her in the eye. He had simply shouted through the door that he was tired of the poverty, tired of the burden of a child he never wanted, and that his new life with a woman who actually had money didn't have room for a ghost from his past. Clara stood there shivering, a woman whose only crime was loving a man who measured worth in bank balances rather than heartbeats. She was penniless, homeless, and for the first time in her life, utterly hopeless. The neon lights of the high-end district blurred into long, jagged streaks of color against the wet asphalt. Clara dragged her suitcase toward a bus stop, but her legs gave out before she could reach the shelter. She collapsed onto a stone bench outside a towering glass skyscraper, the headquarters of Blackwood International. She felt a sharp, frightening cramp in her abdomen and gasped, clutching the cold stone. "Please, not now," she whispered to her belly, her voice trembling. "Not here." She looked up at the golden glow emanating from the lobby of the building. It looked like another world, a world of warmth, security, and safety. To the people inside, she was likely just a smudge on the landscape, a piece of urban clutter to be ignored. She leaned her head against the cold glass, the exhaustion finally pulling her toward a dark, heavy sleep. Even as the thunder rumbled like a warning overhead, she didn't see the black sedan pull up, nor did she see the tall, imposing figure in a charcoal suit step out, shielded by a massive black umbrella held by a silent driver. Arthur Blackwood was a man defined by silence and precision. At 35, he was the youngest billionaire in the country's history. A titan of industry who moved through life with the calculated grace of a predator. He was known for being ruthless in the boardroom and invisible in social circles. People called him the Ice King, a man who had everything but felt nothing. As he stepped toward the entrance of his empire, his eyes caught something that didn't belong. In the shadow of the grand pillars, huddled like a discarded doll, was a woman. Her hair was matted to her face, and her clothes were translucent from the rain. Most people in his position would have signaled security to clear the nuisance. But as Arthur moved closer, the light from the lobby hit Clara's face. He saw the tracks of dried salt on her cheeks, and the way her hands were locked firmly over her stomach, in a universal gesture of protection. Something in Arthur's chest, a part of him he thought had died years ago in the wreckage of his own fractured childhood, shuddered. He stopped. His assistant, a nervous man named Elias, hovered behind him. "Sir, the board is waiting upstairs. The merger papers are ready for your signature." Arthur didn't move. He watched the way the woman's shoulders shook with a silent, rhythmic tremor. She wasn't just cold, she was breaking. "Cancel the meeting," Arthur said, his voice a low baritone that cut through the sound of the rain. Elias blinked, certain he had misheard. "Sir, this is a $4 billion deal. We've been preparing for months." Arthur turned his head slightly, his gaze icy. "I said cancel it. Tell them I've encountered a more pressing matter." He stepped out from under the umbrella, ignoring the rain that immediately began to ruin his $1,000 suit. He walked toward the bench and knelt. He didn't care about the mud or the optics. He saw a human being at the edge of the abyss, and for the first time in a decade, Arthur Blackwood decided to reach out his hand. "Ma'am." He spoke softly, but the authority in his voice was unmistakable. Clara stirred, her eyes fluttering open. When she saw him, she flinched, pulling back in fear. She expected a harsh word, a demand to move along, or perhaps even a threat. Instead, she saw a pair of deep, intelligent eyes filled with an unexpected, searing intensity. "You can't stay here," Arthur said, his tone softening as he saw her terror. Clara tried to stand, her movements clumsy and painful. "I'm sorry," she rasped, her throat raw. "I'll go." I didn't mean to block the way. I have nowhere else." She stumbled, and before she could hit the ground, Arthur's strong arms caught her. He felt the heat of her fever and the undeniable shape of the life she was carrying. In that moment, the Ice King felt a surge of protective fury toward whoever had left her in this state. He looked at his driver and barked an order. "Bring the car around, now! We're taking her to the private wing at St. Jude's." As she was ushered into the plush leather interior of the black sedan, Clara felt like she had stepped into a dream, or perhaps a hallucination brought on by her fever. The scent of expensive wood grain and leather filled her senses, a stark contrast to the smell of wet pavement and despair she had inhaled for hours. Arthur Blackwood sat beside her, maintaining a respectful distance, but keeping his eyes fixed on her pale face. He watched as she shivered uncontrollably, her fingers still interlaced over her abdomen. Without a word, he reached for a cashmere throw tucked into the side compartment and draped it over her shoulders. The warmth was instantaneous, making Clara sob softly. She tried to wipe her eyes, embarrassed by her vulnerability in front of this powerful stranger. "I don't have any money to pay for a hospital," she whispered, her voice barely audible over the hum of the engine. "You don't need money," Arthur replied, his voice firm yet strangely soothing. "Tonight you only need to survive." The drive to the private medical wing was a blur of city lights and silent tension. Arthur's mind was racing. He was a man who lived by logic, yet his actions tonight were entirely impulsive. He knew nothing about this woman, not her name, her history, or how she ended up on his doorstep, but the sight of her had awakened a dormant sense of justice within him. When they arrived at the hospital, a team of doctors was already waiting at the entrance, alerted by a single phone call from Arthur's assistant. They moved with clinical efficiency, lifting Clara onto a gurney. For a moment she panicked, her hand reaching out into the air as if she were drowning. Arthur stepped forward and caught her hand. His grip was steady and warm. "I will be right here," he promised. It was a vow made to a stranger, yet he felt the weight of it in his bones. As they wheeled her through the double doors, he stood in the sterile hallway, looking at his own hands, which were now stained with the rainwater and grime from her coat. Hours passed in the quiet hum of the VIP waiting lounge. Arthur refused to leave, ignoring the frantic texts from his board of directors and the missed calls from his lawyers. He sat in a high-backed chair, staring at the floor, reflecting on the path that had led him to this pinnacle of success. He had grown up with nothing, watching his own mother struggle against a world that didn't care if they lived or died. He had built his fortune as a shield, believing that if he became powerful enough, he would never have to feel helpless again. Yet seeing Clara had reminded him that no amount of money could truly erase the fragility of life. Finally, a doctor emerged, removing his mask. "She's stable, Mr. Blackwood. Exhaustion, severe dehydration, and the beginnings of pneumonia. But the baby is a fighter. The heartbeat is strong. She needs rest, nutrition, and most importantly, peace of mind." Arthur nodded, a heavy tension leaving his shoulders. "Spare no expense. She stays in the luxury suite. I want a full-time nurse assigned to her." The next morning the storm had passed, leaving the city washed in a pale, fragile sunlight. Clara woke up in a room that looked more like a five-star hotel than a hospital. The sheets were silk soft and the air was warm. For a few seconds she forgot everything, the eviction, Marcus's cruel laughter, the rain. Then the memories rushed back, and she sat up with a gasp, her hand flying to her stomach. She felt a soft, rhythmic kick from within, and a sob of relief escaped her. At the foot of her bed sat a brand new set of clothes and a tray of fresh fruit and tea. A knock on the door preceded Arthur's entrance. He looked different today. No suit jacket, his sleeves rolled up, looking less like a titan of industry and more like a man. "You're awake," he said, standing by the window. "How do you feel?" Clara looked at him, her eyes wide with wonder. "Why are you doing this? You don't even know who I am." Arthur walked closer, his expression unreadable. "I know enough. I know you were discarded by someone who didn't deserve you. I know you were protecting your child when you had nothing left for yourself. In my world, that kind of strength is rare." Clara looked down at her hands. My name is Clara, my husband. He left me because we were struggling. He found someone else, someone with a life he wanted more than the one we were building. He said I was a weight around his neck." Arthur's jaw tightened. He had heard variations of this story in business, men sacrificing everything for a perceived upgrade, but hearing it from her made his blood boil. "He was wrong," Arthur said simply. "A person's value isn't dictated by their circumstances, it's dictated by their character." He pulled a chair over and sat down. "I have a proposal for you, Clara. You have nowhere to go, and I have a house with more rooms than I can count. Stay with me. Just until the baby is born. No strings, no expectations, just a safe place to heal." Clara stared at him, searching for the catch. She had spent years being told she was a burden, and now a man who owned half the city was offering her a sanctuary. "I can't accept that," she stammered. "I have to find a job, I have to find a way." Arthur held up a hand to silence her. "You are in no condition to work. Consider it a loan of kindness if that makes it easier. When you are strong again, you can decide your own path. But for now, for the sake of your child, let me help." Clara looked at the sunlight streaming through the window, and then at the man sitting before her. For the first time in months, the crushing weight of fear began to lift. She didn't know if she could trust him, but she knew she couldn't go back to the street. With a trembling lip, she nodded. "Thank you," she whispered. "I don't know how I'll ever repay you." Arthur stood up, a small, rare smile touching his lips. "Just get healthy, Clara. That will be payment enough." Clara's transition from the cold, sterile hospital room to Arthur Blackwood's sprawling estate was like crossing into a different dimension. As the car wound up the private driveway lined with ancient oaks, the massive stone manor came into view, standing as a silent sentinel over the rolling hills. Clara gripped the armrest, her heart hammering against her ribs. She felt like an intruder, a speck of dust in a palace of diamonds. Arthur noticed her white knuckles and reached over, gently placing his hand near hers without touching. "This house has been empty for too long, Clara. Don't feel like a guest. Feel like a resident. My staff has been briefed, and they are here to ensure you don't lift a finger." When the doors opened, she was greeted by a housekeeper, son Mrs. Gable, a woman with silver hair and eyes that crinkled with genuine warmth. Unlike the judgmental stares Clara had received in her old neighborhood, Mrs. Gable looked at her with a tenderness that brought tears to her eyes. "Welcome home, dear," the older woman whispered, leading her toward a suite that had been prepared overnight. The room was a sanctuary of cream and gold. A hand-carved crib already sat in the corner, draped in the finest organic linens. There were clothes in the wardrobe, maternity wear, in soft silks and wools, all in her size. Arthur had thought of everything. For the first few days, Clara did nothing but sleep and eat the nourishing meal Mrs. Gable brought to her. She felt like a wounded animal finally finding a burrow. Arthur, meanwhile, was a ghost in his own home. He left for the office before she woke and returned long after she had retired. Yet every morning there was a small note on her breakfast tray. "The garden is beautiful today. You should see the roses," or "I hope the baby is kicking less so you can rest." These small gestures of humanity, from a man the world feared, began to chip away at Clara's defenses. She realized that Arthur wasn't just providing charity. He was providing a shield. For the first time in her pregnancy, she wasn't worried about where her next meal would come from, or if she'd have a roof over her head. She began to dream again. One evening, unable to sleep, Clara wandered down to the library. The room smelled of old paper and expensive cognac. She found Arthur sitting by the fireplace, a single lamp illuminating a stack of legal documents. He looked exhausted, the lines around his eyes deeper than she had noticed before. He looked up as she entered, and his expression immediately softened. "Clara, you should be resting." She walked toward the fire, the warmth hitting her face. "I wanted to thank you properly," she said, her voice steady. "You saved my life that night. My husband, Marcus, he used to tell me that the world was a cold place and that no one does anything for free. He made me believe that I was worthless because I didn't have a career or a fortune, but you look at me like I'm a person." Arthur closed his folder and stood up. He walked to the window, looking out at the dark expanse of his grounds. "I built this empire because I was told the same thing, Clara. I thought that if I owned everything, no one could ever make me feel small again. But standing in this huge house alone, I realized that I've just built a very expensive cage." They talked for hours that night. Clara told him about her childhood in a small town, her love for painting that she had abandoned to support Marcus's failed business ventures, and the simple dreams she had for her daughter. Arthur listened with an intensity that made her feel seen. He told her about his own mother, who had worked 3 jobs to keep him in school, only to pass away just months before he made his first million. "She never got to see any of this," he said, gesturing to the room. "I think that's why I couldn't walk past you that night. You have the same look in your eyes that she did, the look of someone who would burn the world down just to keep her child warm." A bond began to form, a bridge of shared pain and mutual respect. Clara saw the man behind the billionaire, and Arthur saw the light behind the tragedy. He began coming home earlier, joining her for dinner, and even helping her pick out colors for the nursery. The Ice King was beginning to melt, and the rumors in the city began to swirl about the mysterious woman living in the Blackwood Manor. However, the peace was not destined to last forever. Marcus, Clara's ex-husband, had not fared well since throwing her out. His wealthy new girlfriend had turned out to be a fraud, leaving him in significant debt. One afternoon, while scrolling through a local gossip blog, Marcus saw a grainy paparazzi photo of Clara entering a high-end baby boutique with Arthur Blackwood. His eyes narrowed with a toxic mix of jealousy and greed. He didn't care about Clara, and he certainly didn't care about the baby, but he did care about the potential payday. He realized that if he could prove he was still legally married to Clara, or if he could stir up enough scandal, he could extract a settlement from the billionaire. He began to hatch a plan fueled by desperation and malice. He didn't see a woman he had wronged. He saw a winning lottery ticket. Little did he know Arthur Blackwood was not a man who took kindly to threats against the people he protected. The storm was regathering, but this time Clara wouldn't be standing in the rain alone. The following week was a whirlwind of quiet domesticity that Clara had never thought possible. Arthur had arranged for a world-class prenatal specialist to visit the manor, ensuring that the baby was developing perfectly. For the first time, Clara saw her daughter on a high-definition ultrasound monitor. She watched the tiny flicker of a heartbeat and the movement of miniature limbs, tears of joy streaming down her face. Arthur stood in the corner of the room, his arms crossed, watching the screen with an expression of pure awe. He looked at Clara, and in that moment the distance between their social classes vanished. They were simply 2 people witnessing the miracle of life. "She's beautiful, Clara," he said softly, his voice thick with emotion. Clara reached out, and this time Arthur took her hand, squeezing it gently. The connection between them was growing into something profound, a silent understanding that they were no longer just a benefactor and a refugee. They were becoming a family of choice. But while the interior of the manor was a sanctuary, the world outside was beginning to stir. Marcus had spent days digging into Clara's current situation. He had followed the black sedans, bribed a disgruntled former security guard from Arthur's firm, and gathered enough information to realize that Clara was living a life of luxury he could only dream of. His resentment festered. He felt entitled to the wealth she was enjoying, convinced that since he was the father of the child, he held the ultimate leverage. He didn't see his own cruelty as the reason for her departure. He saw her as a traitor who had moved on to a bigger fish. He spent his last few dollars on a decent suit and a bottle of cheap scotch to steady his nerves, preparing to confront the man who had taken his property. He believed that a man like Arthur Blackwood would pay any price to avoid a public scandal involving a pregnant woman and a messy marriage. One afternoon, as Clara was walking through the rose garden, the tranquility was shattered. A loud, aggressive voice echoed from the front gates. "I know she's in there. That's my wife. You can't keep a man from his wife and child." Clara froze, the color draining from her face. She knew that voice. It was the voice that had shouted insults at her while she packed her bags in the rain. It was the voice that had told her she was a nothing. Marcus was at the gate waving a crumpled marriage certificate and shouting at the security guards. Clara felt a familiar coldness grip her heart. Even in this paradise, her past was clawing its way back to her. She turned to run back into the house, but her legs felt like lead. She felt exposed, vulnerable, and terrified that Arthur would see the chaos she brought and finally decide that she wasn't worth the trouble. Arthur was in his study when the head of security buzzed him. He listened to the report with a face of stone. He didn't show anger. He showed a cold, clinical focus. "Bring him to the gatehouse," Arthur commanded. "Do not let him near the main house, and ensure Ms. Clara is taken to her room immediately." Arthur walked to the window and saw Clara standing paralyzed in the garden. He moved faster than he ever had, reaching her in seconds. He wrapped an arm around her waist, anchoring her. "He can't hurt you, Clara. I promise you he will never lay a finger on you again." Clara looked at him, her eyes wide with panic. "He'll tell everyone I'm a liar. He'll make a scene. Your reputation, Arthur. I can't let him ruin what you've built." Arthur looked toward the gates, his eyes flashing with a dangerous light. "My reputation is built on power, Clara, and today I'm going to show him exactly what that means." In the gatehouse, Marcus was pacing like a caged animal, feeling emboldened by the expensive surroundings. He expected a lawyer or a mid-level manager to come and bargain with him. When the door opened and Arthur Blackwood himself walked in, the air seemed to leave the room. Arthur didn't sit down. He stood over Marcus, his presence filling the small space. "You have exactly 60 seconds to state your business before I have you arrested for trespassing and harassment." Arthur set his voice like a razor. Marcus stammered, trying to regain his bravado. "That woman, Clara, she's my wife. We're having a baby. You can't just take her. I want what's mine. I know how much you're worth, Blackwood. Give me $5 million and I'll walk away. I'll sign the divorce papers and you can keep the burden, as you call it." The silence that followed was deafening. Arthur took a step forward, his shadow falling over Marcus. "I was there that night, Marcus. I saw her in the rain. I saw her collapsed on the stone, shivering, holding her stomach, because the man who was supposed to protect her threw her out like trash. You didn't call her your wife then. You called her a weight." Arthur reached into his pocket and pulled out a digital recorder. He had recorded every word Marcus just said. "You just attempted to sell your child and your wife for $5 million. In the eyes of the law, that's extortion. In my eyes, it's a death sentence for your future." Marcus turned pale, realizing he had walked into a trap. He tried to lung toward the door, but Arthur's security team blocked the way. "You're going to leave now," Arthur whispered. "And if you ever come within a mile of Clara again, I won't use the law. I'll use every resource I have to ensure you disappear from this city's memory." "Do I make myself clear?" Marcus scrambled out of the gatehouse, his bravado shattered like glass against a stone floor. He didn't look back as he ran toward the main road, the weight of Arthur's threat pressing down on him like a physical hand. Inside the manor, Arthur took a deep breath, smoothing his suit jacket and checking his watch. He had handled hostile takeovers and aggressive predators in the business world, but nothing had ever felt as personal as this. He walked back to the main house, his heart heavy with concern for Clara. He found her in the nursery, sitting in the rocking chair, her hands trembling as she stared at the empty crib. The light of the setting sun cast long orange shadows across the room, making the gold accents glow with a bittersweet warmth. "He's gone," Arthur said quietly, leaning against the doorframe. Clara looked up, her eyes red from crying. "What did he want?" she asked, though she already knew the answer. "He wanted to profit from your pain," Arthur replied, walking over to kneel beside her. "He tried to put a price on you and the baby, but I made it clear that you are priceless." Clara let out a shaky breath, a single tear trailing down her cheek. "He won't stop, Arthur. Men like Marcus, they don't see people, they see opportunities. I've brought his darkness into your home." I should leave before it stains your life any further. Arthur reached out gently, taking both of her hands in his. The only thing you've brought into this house is life, Clara. For years I lived in a museum of my own success. It was cold and it was empty. You and that little girl are the first real things that have happened to me in a long time. The following weeks were a period of intense healing. Arthur doubled the security around the estate. But he also did something more significant. He hired a team of private investigators to look into Marcus's past. He wanted to ensure that the man could never threaten Clara's peace again. What they found was a trail of unpaid debts, small-scale frauds, and a history of abandoning responsibilities. Arthur didn't just want Marcus away from Clara. He wanted to build a legal fortress around her. He instructed his lawyers to begin the process of a fast-track divorce, ensuring Clara would receive everything she was entitled to, and more importantly, full and sole custody of the child. He was building a wall of protection that no amount of malice could penetrate. As Clara's due date approached, the bond between her and Arthur deepened into something that transcended gratitude. They spent their evenings in the library, not talking about business or the past, but about the future. Arthur spoke about his plans for a foundation to help women in crisis, inspired by Clara's strength. Clara spoke about picking up her brushes again, wanting to fill the nursery with paintings of the garden. One evening, while they were sharing a quiet dinner, the baby kicked so hard that Clara gasped, dropping her fork. Arthur jumped up, his face etched with worry. "Is it time?" he asked, his voice uncharacteristically frantic. Clara laughed through the sudden discomfort, taking his hand and placing it on the side of her belly. "No, not yet. She's just excited. Feel." For the first time, Arthur felt the distinct, powerful thrum of life under his palm. His eyes widened, and a look of pure, unadulterated wonder transformed his face. In that moment, the billionaire who could buy anything realized that the most valuable things in the world were the ones that couldn't be bought. He looked at Clara, and the air between them changed. It was no longer just about a rescue. It was about two souls finding a harbor in the middle of a storm. "I want to be there," Arthur whispered, his gaze locked on hers. "Not just for the birth, but for all of it. If you'll have me." Clara's heart soared. "Arthur, you've already done so much." He shook his head. "I don't want to be a benefactor anymore, Clara. I want to be a partner. I want to be the man who comes home to you both every night." However, as the sun rose the next morning, a new challenge appeared. A high-profile journalist tipped off by an anonymous source. Likely Marcus's new associate published a scandalous headline: "The Ice King's secret heir, who is the pregnant mystery woman in Blackwood Manor." The article was filled with lies suggesting that Clara had seduced Arthur for his money and that the baby was a pawn in a power play for the Blackwood fortune. The news went viral within hours. Cameras began to gather at the edge of the property, and Arthur's stock prices began to fluctuate. The world wanted a villain, and they had cast Clara in the role. Arthur's PR team was in a panic, urging him to issue a statement, distancing himself from her. They told him his reputation was at stake. Arthur stood in his office looking at the screens filled with gossip and speculation. He saw Clara's face blurred and grainy, being picked apart by strangers who knew nothing of her heart. He felt a cold, familiar rage, but this time it wasn't for himself. He called his head of communications. "I want a live press conference on the front steps of the manor in 1 hour, he commanded. "Sir, that's suicide," the director pleaded. "The media will tear her apart." Arthur straightened his tie, his eyes burning with a fire that hadn't been seen in years. "They won't be looking at her," he said. "They'll be looking at me. I'm going to give them the only truth they need to hear." He went to find Clara, who was hiding in her room, terrified by the drones hovering near the windows. He took her hand and led her toward the grand entrance. "Trust me," he whispered. "The rain is over." The front steps of the Blackwood Manor were swarmed with reporters, their cameras flashing like a rhythmic pulse against the stone columns. Microphones were shoved forward as Arthur stepped out his presence, commanding an immediate heavy silence. He wasn't hiding Clara. He held her hand firmly, her pregnancy visible and proud under a soft velvet dress. The journalists began shouting questions all at once, their voices a cacophony of accusations and curiosity. "Mr. Blackwood, is this your child? Is she a former employee? Are you being blackmailed?" Arthur raised a single hand, and the noise died down, as if he had turned off a switch. He looked directly into the lenses, his gaze steady and unforgiving. "I have spent my life building a name based on cold numbers and hard facts." Arthur began, his voice amplified by the speakers. "But today, I am here to speak about something more important, the truth. The woman standing beside me is Clara. Months ago, I found her in the rain, discarded and abandoned by a man who didn't understand her worth. I didn't take her in because of a deal or a scandal. I took her in because I saw a strength in her that I have never seen in any boardroom. She is not a mystery and she is not a secret. She is a woman who has survived the worst of humanity, and she has done it with grace." He paused, letting the weight of his words sink in. The reporters were frozen, realizing they weren't getting a scandal. They were getting a confession of something far more rare. "As for the child," Arthur continued, "she may not share my blood, but she will share my name. I am officially adopting her the moment she is born. Clara and I are partners in every sense of the word. So if you want a story, here it is, Arthur. Blackwood is no longer alone, and anyone who attempts to harass or defame this woman will find the full weight of my legal team and my resources against them. We are not a headline, we are a family." The crowd was stunned. A billionaire had just put his entire reputation on the line for a woman with no status and no wealth. It was a move so bold, so utterly human, that it effectively killed the scandal. The narrative shifted instantly from a secret heir to the greatest modern-day fairy tale the city had ever seen. As they walked back inside the heavy oak doors, closing out the world, Clara leaned against Arthur, her legs shaking. "You didn't have to do that," she whispered, her voice thick with emotion. "You could have just said I was a guest." Arthur turned to her, framing her face with his hands. "Clara, I've spent 35 years protecting my image. It took me 30 seconds to realize I'd rather protect you. Let them talk. Let them write whatever they want. As long as you know that you belong here, nothing else matters." For the first time, Clara didn't feel like a victim of her past. She felt like the architect of her future. The fear that had lived in her chest for so long finally evaporated, replaced by a sense of belonging that was more valuable than any of the gold in the house. However, in the shadows of a cheap motel on the outskirts of the city, Marcus watched the press conference on a flickering television screen. He saw the way Arthur looked at Clara, with a devotion Marcus was incapable of feeling. He saw the way Clara looked healthy, beautiful, and safe. His plan had backfired spectacularly. Instead of a payout, he was now a pariah. He knew that Arthur's legal team would be coming for him, and the threat of disappearing from the city's memory felt very real. Desperation is a dangerous fuel, and Marcus had nothing left to lose. He knew he couldn't get to Clara through the front gates anymore, but he knew her habits. He knew she still had one doctor's appointment left at the public clinic she had registered at before Arthur found her an appointment he had overheard her talking about months ago. He checked his pocket. He had a small folding knife and a head full of bad ideas. He didn't want the money anymore. He wanted to destroy the happiness he couldn't have. He believed that if he could just get Clara alone for 5 minutes, he could scare her into leaving with him, or at the very least leave a mark on Arthur's perfect life. He was a small man trying to topple a giant, and he was willing to burn himself down to do it. He began to plan his move for the following Tuesday, the day of the final checkup. He didn't realize that Arthur Blackwood had already anticipated his desperation. Arthur wasn't just a businessman. He was a strategist who played the long game, and he had been watching Marcus's every move through the private investigators. The weekend before the appointment was the most peaceful Clara had ever known. She and Arthur spent hours in the nursery, which was now filled with her paintings, vibrant scenes of forests and meadows. They talked about names, settling on Hope for the middle name. It felt right. The house, once a cold museum, was now filled with the scent of fresh lilies and the sound of music. But even as she laughed, Clara felt a lingering shadow. She knew Marcus wouldn't go quietly. "Arthur," she said as they sat on the terrace watching the moon. "What if he doesn't stop? What if he's waiting for the right moment?" Arthur took her hand, his thumb tracing the line of her knuckles. "Let him wait, Clara. The tiger doesn't worry about the sheep. You are under my roof, and my roof covers more than just these walls." The day of the final appointment arrived with a deceptive calm. The sky was a pale, polished blue, and the air held the crisp promise of a changing season. Clara felt a strange fluttering in her heart, a mixture of excitement for the baby and a lingering dread she couldn't quite shake. Arthur had insisted on accompanying her, his presence a towering pillar of security. "You don't have to do this," he told her, as the car pulled away from the manor. "I can have the specialists come back to the house." But Clara had shaken her head. "I need to do this, Arthur. I need to walk into that clinic as the woman I am now, not the broken girl who first signed those papers. I need to close that chapter of my life." Arthur respected her strength, but he didn't lower his guard. Behind their sedan, 2 more discreet vehicles followed, filled with his most trusted security personnel. The clinic was located in a bustling part of the city, a place where the shadows of tall buildings provided cover for 1,000 different stories. As Clara stepped out of the car, she felt the weight of Arthur's hand on the small of her back. It was a silent vow of protection. Inside, the waiting room was crowded, filled with the hum of television news and the soft cries of infants. Clara moved through the space with a newfound dignity, her head held high. She was no longer invisible. However, as they waited for her name to be called, Arthur's phone vibrated. It was a message from his lead investigator. "Subject spotted. 2 blocks away. Moving toward your location. Do not leave the building." Arthur's jaw tightened, but he didn't let his expression change. He leaned in and whispered to Clara, "I need to take a quick business call. Stay right here with Elias. I'll be back before the doctor calls you." Arthur didn't go to take a call. He walked toward the back exit of the clinic where the alleyway met the street. He knew Marcus wouldn't come through the front door. He was a coward who preferred the dark. As Arthur stepped into the cool air of the alley, he saw a figure leaning against a dumpster, a hood pulled low over his face. It was Marcus. He looked haggard, his clothes stained, and his eyes darting with a frantic, feverish energy. When he saw Arthur, he didn't run. Instead, he pulled a small knife from his pocket, his hand shaking. "You think you can just buy her?" Marcus spat, his voice cracking. "You think you can just erase me? I'm the father. That's my blood in her." Arthur didn't flinch. He walked toward Marcus with a terrifying slow-motion grace, his hands empty and his eyes like flint. "Blood doesn't make a father, Marcus." Arthur said, his voice a low, dangerous rumble that seemed to vibrate in the narrow space. "Responsibility does. Love does. Sacrifice does. You possess none of those things." Marcus lunged, a desperate, clumsy move, but Arthur was faster. He stepped aside, caught Marcus's wrist, and twisted it with a surgical precision that sent the knife clattering to the pavement. Before Marcus could scream, Arthur had him pinned against the brick wall, his forearm pressed against the man's throat. "I told you what would happen if you came near her again," Arthur whispered, his face inches from Marcus's. "I have the recording of your extortion attempt. I have the records of your debts, and now I have an attempted assault on camera." He pointed to a small, high-tech drone hovering silently above them. Marcus's bravado vanished instantly, replaced by a raw, pathetic terror. "Please," he wheezed. "I just wanted some money to get out of town. I'm broke. I have nothing." Arthur let go of him, but the coldness in his eyes didn't fade. "You have exactly what you've earned, Marcus. Nothing. My men are waiting at the end of this alley. You have two choices. You can get into that van and be driven to the police station to face charges for extortion and assault. Or you can sign these papers a formal renunciation of all parental rights and a permanent restraining order, and I will pay off your debts and give you a one-way ticket to a city of my choosing. But if you ever return, or if you ever mention Clara's name again, the police will be the least of your worries." Marcus looked at the papers Arthur pulled from his coat, then at the dark-suited men closing in from both sides of the alley. He was a man who had always taken the easy way out, and today was no different. With a shaking hand, he signed the documents, effectively erasing himself from Clara's life forever. Arthur took the papers, checked the signature, and nodded to his team. "Take him. Ensure he gets on the plane. Don't leave him until the wheels are off the ground." As Marcus was led away, looking smaller and more insignificant than ever, Arthur took a deep breath, smoothing his suit. He picked up the knife and dropped it into a nearby bin. The threat was gone. The shadow that had followed Clara from her old life had finally been extinguished by the sun. He walked back into the clinic, his face softening the moment he saw Clara standing by the receptionist's desk. She looked up and smiled a bright, genuine smile that reached her eyes. "Everything okay?" she asked, noticing a slight smudge of brick dust on his sleeve. Arthur reached out and brushed it away, then took her hand. "Everything is perfect, Clara. The business is settled permanently." They were called into the doctor's office, and as they sat together watching the ultrasound of their daughter, the world outside felt a million miles away. The doctor smiled at them, sensing the deep bond between the billionaire and the woman he had rescued. "She's healthy, she's strong, and she's ready," the doctor said. Clara looked at Arthur, her heart overflowing. They were no longer waiting for the storm to pass. They had learned how to dance in the light. The following weeks at the Blackwood Manor were filled with a profound sense of anticipation. But for the first time in Clara's life, it was an anticipation of joy rather than a fear of the unknown. The legal papers signed by Marcus sat in Arthur's safe, a silent, ironclad guarantee that Clara's past would never again lay claim to her future. With the external threats silenced, the atmosphere inside the house shifted. The staff moved with a lighter step, and the grand rooms felt less like a museum and more like a home. Arthur had become an expert in things he once considered trivial: the best temperature for baby formula, the most ergonomic designs for nursery chairs, and the calming effects of different shades of lavender. He had conquered the business world, but he found that preparing for a daughter was the most challenging and rewarding merger he had ever overseen. Clara spent her days in the sun-drenched conservatory finishing her series of paintings. She was no longer the frail woman Arthur had found on the bench. Her skin glowed with health and her eyes held a spark of fire that had been suppressed by years of Marcus's neglect. One afternoon, Arthur found her painting a large canvas, a depiction of a storm clearing, to reveal a golden sunrise over a vast, calm ocean. He stood behind her, watching the confident strokes of her brush. "It's beautiful," he murmured, resting his hands on her shoulders. Clara leaned back against him, sighing contentedly. "It's how I feel," she said. "Like the sun finally found its way through. I used to think I was just a casualty of bad luck, Arthur. But now I realize that every hard thing led me to that bench. And you were there." Arthur turned her around to face him, his expression serious. "I wasn't there by accident, Clara. I think I was looking for you just as much as you were looking for help. I had all the success in the world, but no meaning. You gave me a reason to use what I have for something better than just profit." He took a small velvet box from his pocket. It wasn't an engagement ring, not yet, but inside was a delicate necklace with a pendant in the shape of a blooming rose encrusted with tiny, brilliant diamonds. "The rose from the garden," he explained. "The first thing you loved about this house. I want you to wear it as a reminder that you are the heart of this place." Clara let him fasten the gold chain around her neck, her heart swelling with a love that felt as deep and steady as the foundation of the house itself. As the 9th month began, Arthur's protective instincts reached their peak. He had a medical suite installed on the first floor, staffed with a rotation of top-tier nurses, just in case they couldn't make it to the hospital in time. He stopped going to the office, entirely managing his empire from a laptop in the library, so he was never more than a few feet away from her. They spent their evenings talking about the values they wanted to instill in their daughter. They wanted her to be kind, but strong, humble, but aware of her power. Arthur spoke about setting up a trust fund that would focus on education and social impact, ensuring their daughter understood that wealth was a tool for change, not just a status symbol. Clara listened amazed at how the Ice King had transformed into a man of such warmth and vision. One quiet Tuesday night, while a gentle rain tapped against the window panes, a sound that no longer brought Clara fear, it finally happened. Clara was reading in bed when a sharp, unmistakable pressure surged through her. She gasped, her hand instinctively going to her belly. Arthur, who had been half asleep in the chair beside her, was upright in an instant. "Clara, is it time?" She looked at him, a mixture of excitement and nervous energy in her eyes. I think Hope is ready to meet us." The house erupted into a controlled professional flurry of activity. The nurses moved into position, and the doctor was paged. Arthur never left her side. He held her hand through every contraction, his voice a steady anchor in the sea of pain. "Focus on me," he whispered. "You're the strongest person I know. Just a little further." The labor was long and exhausting, but Clara felt a strange sense of calm. She wasn't alone in a cold hospital ward or shivering in a dark apartment. She was surrounded by care, and she was being held by a man who truly saw her. As the first light of dawn began to creep over the horizon, a sharp, healthy cry filled the room. The doctor lifted a tiny, squirming bundle and placed her on Clara's chest. Time seemed to stand still. Clara looked down at the miracle she had carried through the storm. The baby had a shock of dark hair and a tiny, perfect face that seemed to hold all the secrets of the universe. "She's here," Clara breathed, her voice cracking with joy. Arthur leaned over, his eyes wet with tears as he looked at the child he had claimed as his own. "She's perfect," he whispered. "Welcome home, Hope." In that moment, the journey that had begun on a rainy curb outside a skyscraper reached its destination. The billionaire and the refugee were now mother and father, bound together by a love that had been forged in the most unlikely of circumstances. They sat together in the quiet of the morning, watching the sunrise paint the room in hues of gold and pink. The world outside might still be a complicated, often cruel place, but inside the walls of the Blackwood Manor, a new story was beginning, one built on a foundation of second chances and the unbreakable strength of a mother's heart. They knew there would be challenges ahead, but as they looked at each other over the head of their sleeping daughter, they knew they could face anything as long as they were together. The first few months of Hope's life were a period of soft light and quiet wonder within the Blackwood estate. The man who once lived for global market shifts and hostile takeovers now found himself completely captivated by the way a tiny hand could wrap around his thumb. Arthur had always been a man of action, but now his actions were focused on the gentle rhythm of fatherhood. He was there for every midnight feeding, every restless cry, and every milestone. He had traded his boardroom meetings for lullabies, and to everyone's surprise, the Ice King had never looked more at peace. Clara, too, had blossomed. The shadows of her past had been replaced by a vibrant maternal strength. She spent her days in the sunlit nursery, her paintings now reflecting the immense joy she felt. She was no longer just a survivor. She was the heart of a home. However, the world of high finance and high society didn't stay silent for long. While Arthur had effectively silenced the initial scandal, his rivals were waiting for any sign of weakness. They saw his focus shifting away from Blackwood International and toward his new family, and they moved to strike. A group of disgruntled board members led by a man named Sterling, who had always coveted Arthur's position, began to plot a coup. They claimed that Arthur's personal distractions were a liability to the company, and that his decision to adopt a child of uncertain background had tarnished the brand's prestigious image. They scheduled an emergency vote to remove him as CEO, timed perfectly for when he was most vulnerable. Arthur received the news while he was helping Clara bathe Hope. He looked at the legal notice on his phone, then back at his laughing daughter splashing in the warm water. A year ago, this would have sent him into a cold, calculated rage. Today, it simply felt like a nuisance, a buzzing insect in a beautiful garden. Clara saw the change in his expression. "What is it, Arthur?" she asked, wrapping Hope in a fluffy white towel. Arthur stood up, his gaze hardening just enough to show the tiger was still there. "Sterling is making his move. They want to take the company." Clara stood beside him, her hand resting on his arm. "Then you go and show them why you're the one who built it. But don't do it for the money, Arthur. Do it for us. Show them that a family isn't a distraction, it's a foundation." The day of the board meeting, Arthur didn't wear his usual charcoal suit. He chose a navy blue one, sharp and modern, and he wore the silver watch Clara had given him for his birthday. He didn't walk into the boardroom with the air of a man defending his territory. He walked in with the air of a man who had already won the only war that mattered. Sterling was already at the head of the table, looking smug. "Arthur, glad you could join us. We were just discussing the recent instability of your leadership." Arthur sat down, leaning back in his chair with a calm that unnerved the room. "Instability, Sterling? Or is it that you've mistaken my happiness for a lack of focus?" The meeting lasted for hours. Sterling threw every accusation he had, the drop in stock price during the press conference, the irregularity of his personal life, and the time spent away from the office. But Arthur was ready. He didn't argue, he presented facts. He showed how he had managed the company's largest merger to date while working from home. He showed that the company's public image had actually improved among the younger demographic, who saw his story with Clara as a sign of modern, compassionate leadership. But his final blow was the most powerful. He placed a document on the table, a signed contract with one of the world's largest philanthropic organizations. "I am transitioning Blackwood International into a leader of social responsibility," Arthur announced. "We are launching a global